indication of who's from an SME. A few SMEs in the house. Contracting authorities. And then the mediators will be the rest who'll kind of step in between the two of you as you decide who's got the better role. So yeah, what I'm going to talk to you basically is about low value contracts and the role that has for SMEs and the opportunities that it has for SMEs. So what I'm going to cover broadly is just an overview of SME involvement in public procurement. Now, so when we're talking about low value contracts, obviously there's above threshold contracts that have fall within the EU threshold, so they're covered fully by the directive. So there's very little flexibility there in terms of opportunities for SMEs. But certainly for low value procurement, there's a few more opportunities and there's a bit more scope, I suppose, for SME involvement and for SMEs to really kind of bring themselves to the fore and have a role in public procurement. So I'll talk briefly about the EU principles that apply, and they apply regardless of whether you're talking about above threshold or below threshold. There's certain fundamental treaty principles that apply regardless of what area you're dealing with. I'm going to run through the national rules. To be fair, it probably isn't exactly fair to call them rules. They're more guidelines that are in place, and there's UK, Welsh, and then I'm actually going to talk about the Irish rules in a little bit of detail because while Irish people love to, we're a very fair race, we only talk ill of one another. The Irish rules are actually quite good in terms of being quite practical in ensuring that SMEs have good access to procurement, and they've taken, I think it's fair to say, more measures than the UK and the Welsh have. So just to kind of get an idea of what sort of opportunities there are there to, and basically those Circular 1010, as it's called, and I'll get to it a bit later, that was born out of pressure that was put on the government to ensure that SMEs had good opportunity and good scope to get involved in public procurement, and it was all from pressure. So I suppose if SMEs want to get greater involvement, and to be fair, it's across the EU, people are trying really hard to make sure that SMEs do have that platform, if you like, to get fully engaged in public procurement. There are more ways to do it. So if politicians, I was going to say publicans, if politicians, publicans probably won't help you very much, but if politicians are aware of the potential options, it's good to be able to just highlight that there are more opportunities there. So SME involvement in public procurement is a consistent problem, and to be fair, I think it's fair to say that certainly in Ireland, and I imagine the same is true here, since the kind of recessions, double dip and triple dip, and however many kind of dips up and down we go, recessions have hit, I think public procurement has become more of an opportunity for SMEs. So whereas in the past, there was enough private work to go around and everyone got a good bite of the cherry, I think now public procurement is seen as a better, kind of more consistent deliverer of contracts, and you'll get paid, if not within the kind of allocated 30 days, certainly soon after. So it's seen as a more stable form of work relative to private work. So I think it's become more attractive for SMEs. And as I said, I think that is slightly born out of the business and economic environment that we're in at the moment. Governments across the EU and indeed the Commission have all taken the SME role quite seriously and have looked at it. There's been various studies carried out to find out how best SMEs can become more involved and how a more level playing field can be set up. And I suppose in that regard it's worth noting that when we talk about facilitating SME involvement in public procurement, it is just about levelling the playing field. SMEs can't be given greater opportunities than anyone else. It has to be a level playing field. But there are ways that, if the mountain doesn't go to Muhammad can come to the mountain. That balance can be struck, and we can definitely get more SMEs involved. There's a need to keep guidance up to date because, as I said, I know the EU looked at it in 2008. There was a study published And the UK and Irish governments have certainly been looking at it on a consistent basis. But I know I was looking at some of the guidance, and it seems to be a little bit dated, and I think it could be refreshed every now and again. And you're reading about these massive strides that were taken in 2008, and you're sort of wondering what exactly has happened since. And that work is being done and that the success has been built on, but it needs a little bit more. As I said, in 2008, the Commission published a code of best practice on SME participation in public procurement, and that basically went through the sort of obstacles that can come up for SMEs and how they can be tackled and how solutions can be put in place. Quite practical solutions, as I said, not necessarily favouring SMEs, but giving SMEs fair access to those opportunities as they exist. And personally, I think that there's a role for both governments, contracting authorities, central government, and for SMEs in improving SME opportunities. So I don't think SMEs can expect all the opportunities to come to them. I think they have to go out there and look for the opportunities because they are there. Certainly more can be done to facilitate them in a greater way, but I think there's responsibilities on both sides. So now, I apologise if in the course of the next 3 slides I say anything that sort of alienates anyone from a contracting authority or an SME, because I'm talking about their perceptions of one another. So I'm not saying that it's universally true or accepted or anything like that. So once I've all my qualifications out of the way, I think the barriers to SMEs, there's a sense that there's a public sector culture, that maybe there's kind of risk averse, kind of more focused perhaps on getting the procedure right than getting the right result, that kind of thing, that the process is too bureaucratic. And to a certain extent it has to be, because you're dealing with directives and regulations. It is law at the end of the day. And I know essentially what procurement is buying goods and services. It's like we all do it when we go into Tesco's or Waitrose or wherever we go. It's not, as a fundamental idea, it's not that difficult. And here there are like all these layers, admittedly, of bureaucracy and procedures being added to it. But I suppose they're there for good reason. And they're there to ensure there's a level playing field and to ensure that the best results are achieved. But sometimes perhaps people can kind of hide behind the process rather than trying to seek out a good result certainly for local communities or the country in general. I think there can be a sense that there's too much of an emphasis on price rather than value. So when you're looking at a contract, do you say, all right, the call-out charge for this particular service is €50 with a 4-hour delay, or do you look at it and say, okay, well, it's an extra €50, but they'll be there in 15 minutes. So, you have to value what you're getting and what you're paying for and where the value is actually going to be derived from. And then there is a sense, and this isn't coming from me, it's from the literature, that says that public sector purchases tend to be risk averse. I think it probably is true, and certainly from some of the studies I have read, it does seem that there is probably or possibly a disproportionate emphasis on getting the procedures right and following the procedures rather than kind of taking a helicopter view and saying, what's the result we're looking for here? What are we hoping to achieve and how best do we achieve it? So, looking at it as well from a contracting authority's point of view, and it can be difficult to balance both of their objectives, because the public sector buyer he or she wants to buy correctly, wants to follow the rules, wants to get the right result, and sometimes it can be easy to kind of think that the biggest is the best, and that the people who have the reputation in the market are the people who are going to deliver you the best service, which isn't necessarily the case. Sometimes it is the case, but certainly the perception of SMEs is that the qualifications and capacity requirements that are set out in PQQs are too high, so they're disproportionate. Now, that shouldn't be the case, because EU treaty principles, regardless of whether you're above threshold or below threshold, say that proportionality has to be, abided by in each contract. So whether you're buying I don't know, 20 loaves of bread, or whether you're buying, you know, kitchen equipment to bake all the bread for the year, you know, the turnover requirements or the technical requirements have to be have to be proportionate for both. So that shouldn't matter whether you're above contract or above threshold or below threshold. All the requirements should be proportionate. The size of contracts, I think that again the perception of SMEs is that contracting authorities look to purchase on a large scale when they could just as easily purchase on a smaller scale. So they could have a contract that could be divided into lots, where lots of different parties would have an opportunity to supply. And equally, you could have, say, a multi-party framework where instead of awarding to just one party, you're awarding to lots of different parties. And again, everyone has that opportunity, say, in the context of a mini competition, to offer the best value that they can at any particular time. Now, that's the SME perception. I suppose if you're working for a contracting authority, you can see the merits of running one big procedure and getting it kind of one and done, rather than having lots of lots and dealing with more different parties. So there is that balance to be struck, and this is what I'm saying, that there is a role for contracting authorities and tenderers to try and get that balance together. So that SMEs are given the opportunity, and if they're good enough, that they kind of get on panels and that they're awarded contracts, and that everyone kind of can work quite well together. This is something that I think is definitely being addressed across all the member states that I've looked at. SMEs, certainly up to the mid-2000s, were complaining that they weren't getting enough access to information, and that the information that they were given wasn't up to scratch. Now, I don't know what your experience is, and we can chat about it during the Q&A after. But certainly I think contracting authorities and government are very keen to ensure that SMEs are given good information, up-to-date information that will make them better tenderers. Actually, does anyone have any views on that now? Do you feel that you're getting enough information to submit a good tender, or do you think it's still weighted in favour of the bigger suppliers?
I think, from the sorts of contracts I've been involved with, or that my members have been involved with, which are fairly small, so only SMEs would go for them, there's not been enough definition of what's required, so that when the tender is actually put in, you don't know whether the fact that you're giving an added value is being weighed up or not.
Okay, and do they ask for clarification in terms of what exactly is required and what exactly will be?
And 9 times out of 10, they don't get an answer, and I think that's mostly because the contractors within the local authorities in North Wales, how can I put this politely? Probably don't have the expertise, the experience and the knowledge to actually put a good invitation to tender together. In fact, I would go so far as to say that every one local authority has put the most dreadful tenders together for this year.
So not great feedback there then. I think that's...
And in fact, they're already 6 months out of date, 6 months over their time limit for the tenders out.
Okay, well that's... I'd like to think that that's not a universal experience. And obviously can't defend people I don't know, but the efforts that are being made are definitely to try and improve that. And I suppose, all anyone can do in that scenario is seek clarification in terms of what exactly is required. And I suppose, I've dealt with clarifications where people have asked quite obscure questions that it is actually quite difficult to answer. So I would say when you're seeking clarification, to do it in the simplest terms possible. So if something how will value added extras be scored in this particular tender, or what would they be scored under? So if you're going to be putting in a bit of value add, that under what sections to put it in, so that it will actually gather extra marks rather than kind of putting it in different areas where it may be ignored. So just try and ask and have the most pointed clarifications that you can. Does anyone else have any sort of experience of that?
I think the information generally is pretty good, certainly if you go back and ask questions, where the answers are open to
everyone.
all the tenderers.
Yeah.
And when I read some of the questions, and I think to myself, why the hell have you asked that?
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to defend the people, the procurers, but sometimes you look at the questions that are being asked for the tenderers, and I think you should have read what was in the document, and quite often you got your answer already in there.
Yeah, and I mean, more often than not, the answer to clarification is please see section 5.3, where you will see that, and you give your answer. So, I mean, what I think, and again, I mean, as lawyers, we have to tender occasionally as well. And what I find is if things are left, and obviously I'm speaking about my previous job now, but if things are left to the last minute, that's when those types of questions are being asked, because, you know, people are under pressure to try and get the tender together, and they're literally kind of scraping at the last minute, and, you know, you're submitting your questions even though had you read the document, it would have been fairly apparent. But I mean, and that's when you have the resources in-house to draft a tender, and when you have marketing people who are there and it's their job to put tenders together in nice kind of glossy forms, that's makes life a lot easier. When you're an SME who has, you know, a core kind of group of, say, 5 people or 10 people, and everyone has a day job that they have to do, and then drafting tenders comes on top of that. I mean, that's when it gets very difficult, because, you know, if you're talking about overtime and, you know, people having to, inevitably, if the tender deadline is, you know, 12 o'clock, you know, more often than not, there will be a late night the night before, as everything is kind of read and reread and spell checked and, you know, all put together and bound nicely or whatever. So you will find that people have to, there is a lot of cost involved, and there is a lot of commitment, and if you're not getting the results, it's very disheartening, and that's when SMEs can get sort of alienated and feel like, well, what's the point? You know, I put in so much work, and it goes back to the feedback point. Unless they understand where they're going wrong, it's quite easy to just say, well, public procurement clearly isn't for me because I'm just not getting the results that I was hoping to get out of it. So that's just the last sprint attitudes to it at times. So then, the Department of Finance Circular 1010, and this is what Mary Liz mentioned earlier. I put some highlights in here, but there's if you want to Google it, it's on the I think it's on the constructionprocurement.ie website, and if you just Google Circular 1010, it'll come up. But that goes through various options that are open to contracting authorities to facilitate SME involvement, and it's aimed at encouraging SME participation. So it requires advertising for contracts over 25,000. They try to make the open procedure basically obligatory for below threshold contracts, and I suppose the advantage to that is you cut out the PQQ stage, so people are actually preparing their tenders, submitting their tenders. And in terms of the PQQ, if there are financial requirements, you can self-certify. So you can say, yes, we certify that we comply with the minimum requirements that are set out. And then, so basically it's their tender that's looked at, and if they're successful, then they go back and call in their financial statements to ensure that there is compliance. So that they correctly self-certify that they met the minimum requirements. So that, I think, is quite a good way of making sure that everyone has a fair kind of fist in the fight and an equal bite of the cherry, to add lots of cliches there. But so that I think is quite a useful feature for SMEs. That self-certification means that there's less documentary evidence required up front. But the tenderers must confirm that they can produce the evidence when requested. You can't charge a tenderer to take part in the tender, which, to be fair, I don't think is really a feature of procurement in Ireland anyway. But they explicitly say it there. Framework agreement should be completed where appropriate. They say that large tenders should be divided into lots. And I know from the works perspective, some of the some of the individual sort of, let's say, mech and elec and those kind of contracts can be awarded separately to the overall tender in certain occasions. The contracting authorities are encouraged to communicate their requirements in advance, so that people can be aware of their obligations. The capacity requirements have to be relevant and proportionate, but again, that's basically the EU fundamental treaty principle just in action. I mean, that applies regardless. In terms of financial turnover thresholds, they say that the value of a contract should range from anything to, so if the value of the contract is, say, €1 million, they're saying the turnover requirement should be anything between €500,000 and €3 million. So it should either be between half or up to 3 times the value of the contract, depending on the nature of the contract. So obviously, you know, if it's something that's very complicated or something where there's, you know, a significant financial risk to the contracting authority, you know, it will be a higher turnover requirement. They require debriefing, and they say it should be a constructive debriefing. So basically, you know, you should be informing the tenders of how they've gone wrong and how best to address that in the next round. If there is shortlisting at any stage, it should be objective and non-discriminatory. So it's quite a long document, and there's a lot in it. I think that it actually puts some meat, if you like, on what SMEs can expect. Now, John asked the question earlier, you know, to what extent is this binding? And that's something of a source of debate. Initially, when it came out, the feeling would have been it's a guideline. Guidelines are just that, they're guidelines. But there's at least one barrister who found some provision in like a 1907 Local Government Act or something. And basically there's a provision of the Local Government Acts that say that guidelines are binding on local authorities. So the argument would be that it's, and it hasn't been tested yet as far as I know, or it certainly hasn't, there's been no judgment on it. But the argument would be that it's potentially binding on local authorities, probably not binding on others, like say the HSE, which would be the equivalent of the NHS, unlikely to be binding by them because they're not governed by the Local Government Acts. But certainly there is a sense, if you like, that it's people are following it more now. It's definitely, you know, whatever conferences you go to in Ireland, you'll usually find at least one session on Circular 1010 as people get their heads around it and go, do we have to follow it? And certainly our advice would always be, it's definitely safer too, because you don't want to be the first case where they say you should have and you didn't. And to be fair, there's nothing hugely out of the ordinary in it. It's basically just affording everyone an equal opportunity and creating that level playing field. So you're not favouring SMEs in doing this, but you're just giving them an equal chance to participate and to take part. So that's Circular 1010. Then just in relation to works, I mean, maybe the slide should have come before the last, but there's a capital works management framework that says that for contracts of less than €50,000, they should give serious consideration to publishing on e-tenders, invite at least 5 tenderers to tender, and look for value for money over lowest price. And then between contracts between €50,000 and the EU threshold, you have to advertise on e-tenders. The time period for receipt of tenders must be at least 21 days. And again, that feeds back to the point that it takes time to draft a tender. And I mean, when you see the quality of some of the tenders that come in, you realise that some people spend a lot of time drafting tenders and put a huge amount of work in it. And if you are from an SME, or if the tender does come from an SME where they have a limited staff, you know, a huge amount of work can go into producing that document. And I suppose they just want to get that sense that they're getting, it's not being sent in for no good reason, and that they do have as good a chance as any to take part. So they need the time to prepare the tender. They say that, yeah, the open procedure should be used for contracts that are up to 250,000. And again, this self-certification process. So rather than having to send in all your financial statements, management accounts or profit and loss, whatever it might be, balance sheets, that you can self-certify that you meet the minimum requirements, and then if you're successful, then you send in the documents and they just confirm that. So in summary then, the objective of the EU and governments across all the member states is to create a level playing field. So it's not to favour SMEs, but it's just to make sure that there is an equal opportunity and a fair chance for all. There's an attempt to reduce the formal procedural requirements imposed by contracting authorities, which is useful. But again, in going back to that local authority, that Irish local authority with 127 tenders to review, you know, it can, reducing the burden for SMEs can sometimes end up increasing the burden for contracting authorities. But again, maybe that's about, or maybe the way for a contracting authority to get around that is to be very clear on what exactly it requires, so that if an SME or any company for that matter knows that it can't take part, then, or knows that it, you know, it's not up to scratch, then they just won't participate. Because I think what you had in that was a lot of kind of one-man bands going, oh sure, look, I'll send in a tender and see what happens. But you know that you still have to write 127 standstill letters after that, so it's not necessarily easily done. The fundamental treaty principles must still be followed, and again, I suppose say in terms of that self-certification point, it can lead to less certainty for contracting authorities that the procedural requirements have been met. So the more flexibility that they add in, that a contracting authority adds into a process, the more fear I think they have that they might somehow undermine the rules. And then there is, I think it was in the UK, there was a mystery shopper report carried out, and I have to say I would love for that to be done in Ireland. I just think it would be the best reading ever, because whenever you give procurement training, like you hear all the war stories, so I just loved if they were all compiled in one report and you could go in to your next training and say, these are the war stories, you don't want to be here. But yeah, there was a mystery shopper report carried out, and it became clear that contracting authorities are reluctant to move away from PQQs. And again, you can sort of see why, in terms of if you've the choice between reviewing 20 PQQs and selecting 5 to call for tender, is that preferable over having to review 20 tenders? You know, possibly yes, but again, it's all about, do you look at the process or do you look at the result? If the result is that looking at 20 tenders gives you a better outcome, is that not the better approach to take? But it might just take a while for that to sort of filter in. The self-certification issues, I've heard of some sort of anecdotal reports that in Ireland where people do self-certify, there have been issues where some successful people haven't been able to stand over the self-certification, and then there's a delay as they then have to go to number 2, send out the new standstill letters, do all that kind of fun stuff, which isn't ideal. And then again, the proportionate financial requirements and indeed technical requirements, that commitment that's in most of the guidelines is great for SMEs, but my view would be that it should have applied all the time, because it's one of the fundamental treaty principles that there is non-discrimination and equal treatment. So everyone, proportionality is one of those principles. So it should have applied always. So it shouldn't be people shouldn't be so grateful for it, because they should have expected it all along. So now we'll move to the Q&As. Hopefully there'll be lots of things to talk about.